symbols? What's the relevance of symbols?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because you can do psychotherapy, social work, psychology, counseling, without figurines, without symbols. What happens when we do learn how to use them is that we have this opportunity to come through the back door of consciousness. And when it comes to clients with trauma, deep grief and loss, any kind, mind, body, relationships, friends, whatever, that we can actually have the figures act as a third helper, a helping person. It could be a rock, it could be a tree, it could be a porpoise.
Mm-hmm.
So what figurines do is that because it's a projective technique that we're talking about, then they can come alive and be a third factor. So it's like jumping, it's the emotions and the lived experience and the memories can jump out of us and be given to the porpoise or to the tree, and then we're able to, it's distancing it and witnessing it and recognizing and acknowledging it, sometimes for the first time in our lives. To see the devouring crocodile or to see the helpful little bird. All of these the therapist can use to support in a positive way. I think the caveat that I want to add is not to extract like a dead tooth. We're not extracting information from clients. And therapists need to be trained in order to use these in an empowering, positive, supporting way, and not a diminishing extraction. It's not a personality test.
Yeah, I think one of the ways that I've heard you articulate it previously is that I think you used the word externalizing, and so that sense that the natural filters that we would have to say as a middle-aged male to talk about, say, a trauma when someone my age was a child might be it would feel artificial, or it would feel like how I'm not a little baby anymore or something like this.
Yeah, real defended too, in an
Right.
appropriate way.
Right.
Why would we want to talk about the horrific experiences of childhood? We've tried to bury those. And you bring up the word externalization. So from a narrative psychology point of view, narrative therapy, White and Epstein's work that comes out of Australia and New Zealand, the original work, Social Construction, is that we've been constructing stories our whole lives to understand, to grasp, to deal with those traumas, to help bury them down there so we can be resilient and move forward. And so our brains neurologically are on a rote here, and what three-dimensional objects can do is help us move into, if you will, an imaginary way, a fourth dimension, which is to represent, to externalize our story, and then, like social construction, like narrative therapy, reframe that so that it's empowering and we're not carrying the shame and degradation that we have had to deal with our whole lives, the 3-year-old and the 103-year-old. So the way we move in the world is that we fill up with these stories, with things that people have said about us, that we're stupid or ugly or unworthy or incompetent or not worth it or we shouldn't be alive. Horrible things. And those of us who do survive become resilient, we move forward, and what can happen with three-dimensional objects is we can take out, to externalize, to remove that part, that story. Let's look at that frame like on a magic huge film strip, like a Disney film strip. We can go in and look at that story and say, what was shameful and difficult and painful about that, and how can we reframe that to return the power to the person, to help heal what we'll call that wound, emotional wound.
Right, and there's something about the externalization process which allows us to engage these memories, these experiences in such a way that the 3-year-old then is able to be seen not as, so when we experience, as we've talked about it previously, when we experience a trauma at 3 or 5 or 8 or whatever it is, the only stored memory we have of it is the memory of the experience itself, and the perception that's stored with that is the perception of the 3-year-old
It's
or the
our
5-year-old.
interpretation at 5.
Right, and
Yes.
maybe a lot of that interpretation may be handed down from caregivers or from other witnesses
Bullies.
or bullies, whoever was there.
uh-huh.
So to externalize it allows us to evaluate it from so in the tray is this figure, and that's like the 3-year-old, and as the story is told, then it's an externalized 3-year-old. It's just a 3-year-old that's there. It's not me
Yes.
anymore.
Right.
And that 3-year-old, then I get to, when I'm talking about the figure, I get the sense of empathy, the sense of perspective that I would have at my age now.
And it's a puppy dog.
Right.
It's not a little person. It's a puppy dog, or it's a lamb, or it's a tiny dinosaur. And we can build our empathy for the first time for that part of ourselves. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, and I want to put a footnote. Yes, the caregivers or bullies or whoever was around, but religion, society, culture, cultural norms, all of these pre-programs and stereotypes that we have, those get loaded in and packed around. So here the trauma is packed around all of this newsprint, if you will, or computer programming, that is making something out of this little soul that is destructive, that's demoralizing, that's stealing away from that little one's integrity. And that little one could be 3, 33,
Right,
63, it doesn't matter.
right.
Yeah.
And the beliefs then right, so whatever the experience then, this sort of whirlwind or
Yes.
the Jungian,
Yeah, the complexes?
the complexes that
Yes.
surround the
Yeah.
ideas, the beliefs that surround it all, just kind of get baked in. And this process allows then for a reevaluation of that, or a reassessment of what are the beliefs that one might want to take out of this
And
experience,
that's called
looking at it.
reclamation. And
Yeah.
that's the reclaiming of those parts.
Mm.
That, no, I'm going to take this one now,
Mm.
but I'm going to leave that shameful piece, that piece that said I was no good, or that I was stupid, or that I was ugly, or that whatever it was, we don't want you. I'm going to reclaim. I'm going to take this piece that says I can survive. I'm a good enough person, and I can move forward with some freedom. We bring in the existential. We rediscover freedom. We've been bound and trapped. We rediscover meaning. What is your meaning? What is the little lamb or puppy dog's meaning? And not the meaning that was layered on, as you say, baked in. Yeah. So that's why we use symbols. You know, an object, a figurine, becomes a symbol only when I project on it. Otherwise, it's in the 5 and dime store, the Goodwill, or the Michaels or whatever.
It's a piece of plastic
it's
wood
there,
or whatever
but
it is.
as soon as I see it, and I think more recently, computer gamers really understand this. We and the the movie series and everything, where people become really gripped by a character and really love that character. Well, that's always been true from fairy tale books, fairy tale movies, and then the new genre on computer games and the movies that are created from that. So it's the power of image that it electrifies people, and that's all psychological, it's neurological, it's in our body.
Right, and what you're talking about there is how even with computers, with the technology that we have now, that we're not even dealing with necessarily a concrete symbol anymore, but we're just dealing with these representations, these lighted up spaces on a screen. But even through that, we then read into it the symbol. We see the
Yes.
and
Yeah.
so we're doing that's our projection.
Right.
And we're doing the same thing then with whether it's a piece of plastic or a piece of wood or a rock or whatever it is.
That new series, not new anymore, I guess it's finished, the Game of Thrones, where many people were so excited about different characters and different plots and all of that. And that's what we're doing in psychotherapy when we're using sand therapy, is we're using an array of symbols, but it's in a tray that contains the energy. The movie script contains it on the screen or the TV, but in therapy, it is a sand tray that contains that energy, that drama that's being activated, that's emerging out of there.
And it's the client's movie then. It's the
Yes.
client's
Yes.
experience.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
and therapists need to be keen about that and study so that they have a vocabulary. While they're listening to this language, it is never time for the therapist to insert themselves. But this is what elephant means here in India or over in Africa or in the circus or in a zoo. What is the integrity of elephant in its native jungle? And then we look at the cultural meaning. So therapists need to study that, but they don't say to the client, for example, and we're getting off point here, but we would never use a symbol to say, there's your mother and your father, kind of thing. It is a language that we learn, but the story always belongs, the projections always belong to the client. The therapist has to learn their own projections.
I think that's a really important point, because it's not infrequent to have a client come and ask, so complete a tray and ask. I've even seen them ask you directly, I would like your interpretation or something like that.
Right, yeah, as if there was a book we read in the back.
Right, and it sounds like you're saying something very different from that.
Correct.
That no, this isn't
Yeah.
what we're looking for.
No, the story and the power and the interpretation belong within the client. So what is the dinosaur to you? And the dinosaur is having a conversation with that little lamb. And the puppy dog is over in the corner. And you're telling me about this. So as a child, I'm listening to that story, but what I should be feeling is empathy. What is each one of those feeling? What I should be able to slip
What are
into
the
their
symbols
moccasins.
feeling?
What might it be like to be the puppy over in the corner looking on while the rabbit and the fawn and the dinosaur are all having a conversation? What might that feel like? I should be in touch with that, and that's what training is about.
And what you're saying then is that figure that you're trying to resonate with as the clinician is a projection then of the client's 3-year-old self or 8-year-old self or
As
whatever
well
it is.
as the therapist projection.
Right, okay.
So I don't speak my projections because client may say, the puppy has just come on the scene and is so happy to see his friends after missing them for so many years. So we want to make sure that the array of our understanding, I resist the word interpretation, but our array of understanding is this could be a very alienated, depressed little pup that's timid and has been bullied, he's been afraid, but sees his friends, or like I just said,
Could be excited or something.
Yeah, so we have to be careful, but we have to cultivate our understanding of the symbolic by immersing ourselves, not with the client, but immersing in our own work. And then I think existential therapy, narrative therapy, Jungian psychology, the analytic. And also there are other, attachment theory is really important to have an understanding of the symbolic, but also to go back to mythology and really review what Joseph Campbell was talking about and examine symbol books across cultures so that we understand a rainbow in Ireland or, with at the Wizard of Oz and for lesbian gays. These are a whole array of different interpretations. In the Bible, the rainbow will mean one thing,
right.
and for Noah, and then for somebody else who's never seen a rainbow, or somebody who lives in Hawaii where there's multiple rainbows. So we want to be aware of cultural interpretations, personal interpretations, as well as our own lived experience projections.
So the work of the clinician then is to learn their own projections. Not in order to dismiss them, but in order to be able to recognize them, resonate.
Yes.
But ultimately, it's the client's projection that matters when we're working with a client.
Exactly. And we're
Our
not
projections are just to sort of help facilitate
Yes.
or amplify whatever the
Yes,
client
exactly.
is producing.
In order for me to resonate more fully with what that elephant is going through, I have to understand the tusk trade and how animals are killed just for their tusks. I have to deeply resonate with that murderous activity for the arrogance of humankind. And I also have to understand the honor in India and in other Asian countries, the magnificence of this beautiful animal. And so, so.
And so the elephant might, while you're resonating with that, I could be a 7-year-old client who
Yes.
comes in and sticks an elephant in the tray,
that
and
they
I'm
saw
just
at the
remembering,
circus.
yeah, I saw it at circus or the
Yes.
zoo, and it has no relevance to anything else.
Right, doesn't matter.
But as a clinician, you're saying to resonate with all these different levels
Yes.
opens the possibility of connecting with clients in
Yes.
a much larger
Deeper,
range,
deeper,
yeah, and
yes.
amplifying their work.
Because if
And so-
I'm 7 or 4 and I went to a circus and it was this big, or a zoo,
Mhm.
and there's a big elephant, yes, I want to hear that story and honor that, and that's the truth. But inside of me, I should have the capacity to be able to recognize where over a series of sand scenes, over months, what happens to elephant as it returns. What happens to the dinosaur that has been dead. So I watch for the progression through the film strip of the sand scenes.
Can you say what you're watching for in that? Like what is the transition that's remarkable or noteworthy in that?
I think as an anthropologist or a paleontologist, both, I would look for the lived experience of dinosaur, digging it up as a anthropologist going into a culture, and then finding out what the lived appropriate, what is this cultural worldview? So what I want to understand is what's the cultural worldview of a possibility for elephant. And then when I get that emotional experience, what their lived experience, how they are emotions, they have families. When I do that, then I'm also, my brain will fire when I'm listening to the child's story or the adult or the couples
Whatever the
therapy.
client is.
Yeah, elders, geriatric. So I'm listening to their story. What is the missing piece? Because they're in therapy for a reason. They're in therapy because of deep grief and loss, trauma, or because of emotional pain, the loss, the death of. That's going to eventually be shown, but first, let's go to the circus.
And so correct me if, what I think I understand you to be saying then is that as you resonate with the identity of the elephant in this instance.
Multiple
and,
identities.
All right, sure, but talking about specifically the trade
the
and
child's.
tusk or something like this, as you're resonating with that experience, if I understand you correctly, it's not that you're saying you want to educate the child on the,
No, never.
immoral trade in
No.
ivory.
No.
It sounds like what you're doing is trying to immerse yourself in and empathize with as broad of a range of potential experiences that figure could represent as you can.
Okay.
And in doing that, then you're empathizing with or potentially empathizing with aspects of the client's lived reality or part of their lived reality that they themselves may not be able to empathize
There
with.
you go, right there,
Okay.
spot on, right on. Because now if we do engagement, which we'll do a whole video on how to engage with clients, but let's just take this adolescent I went to, maybe they had a stepdad and went to the circus or to the zoo and saw an elephant. And it was, I never saw that before. It was really sad to see it all trapped in there. So what I'm going to hear is the sadness. I'm not going to comment on it. I'm going to hear that, but I now have a reservoir in back of my own psyche about the damage that we have created with other sentient beings. So I'm going to listen for that. Now, they may have been excited, but if I'm going to do an engagement, I'm not going to teach that right now, but if I'm going to do an engagement, I might ask that 13-year-old, would you like to explore part of your scene? I said, yeah, this was so much fun when I went with my stepdad before he was shipped to Afghanistan or whatever. How did you feel about that? And would you like to revisit it? And they step in. How is the elephant feeling? What does the elephant want to say to you? And that's when they can connect with a part of them that they were not conscious of before.
Right. And your amplification during that process, based on your own awareness of your projections and awareness of what you're feeling, your amplification then is what will potentially facilitate them identifying with or regaining that part of themselves.
Yes, because if we're having a conversation, they go, wow, I was really also kind of sad to see it trapped. Yeah, how deep was that sadness? What would you want to have
Which may
said
be
to
a sadness that's just been nebulous or not even fully conscious.
Exactly.
So when that comes into consciousness in Gestalt, we might call it, what is it, the
It just,
incongruence becomes congruence, right?
yes, Yes, yes. And that's then the reclamation, that the elephant has gifted you the joy of discovery there are elephants and the pain of being alienated and entrapped with no freedom. And that's very powerful therapy. And that's why we use symbols. Maybe we should wrap this up.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a part of this that you want to really underscore about the use of figures and their importance in our therapeutic process.
Well, maybe you could talk for a minute about archetypes and just the role of figures in terms of how they might represent a number of different layers, I guess, to each figure.
My hypothesis is that a sand scene is not only what the child says or doesn't say, because they may stay in silence, but it's layered always with the familial, their family of origin, the lived developmental experience, their own private developmental experience, which we can't see, their culture and society, as well as the unconscious. And so from a Jungian point of view, archetypes, and there's just a gazillion archetypes, is that, if you will, the centerpiece. I'm going to use one of the most common, the mother archetype. And all of my experiences with my own mother, with mother images, which could be teachers or coaches and political leaders around the world, any woman figure.
Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa, Queen Elizabeth,
Yeah.
all of these. So around the archetype of the mother is that swirl of the complex of my lived experience and my imaginings. So that could be pretty horrific.
So even female superheroes or
Exactly.
mythological
Witches
figures would
from
all come
the
into play.
Alice in Wonderland,
Yeah.
the evil queen, or
Fairy
in
tales, right?
Yes. So we have these good and bad mother images. So the archetype might be represented by the cow. So I might see the cow if I've studied cow well enough. I might see cow in among other things in the sand scene. So what my brain is going to is, here's the potential of a female archetype, the mature female archetype, which could be the potency of the mother. So I will be, but we're not going to go into Jungian training,
sure.
but just to answer your question, that with part of our more full training in sand therapy, not just sand tray, not just sand play, and not just narrative sand therapy,
Right.
which is my own construction, but also a combination. So we can bring in Adlerian. I love Milton Erickson, and I use it a great deal with this. So we want therapists to be mindful that an object is never just a single object. It is a Russian egg that represents Mother Russia and represents the mother bear in in Korean. We have the bear for Korean representation. So all of these figures can come then to that point of representing the masculine or the divine or the child or the great mother. And every culture has that. We go into Navajo, Cherokee, it's
Each one.
powerful.
So the figure, one single figure then can represent the client's lived experience directly, could represent their perceived experience or their perception of the feminine in general.
Their mom.
Right? It
Yes,
could,
yes.
so, and also then could represent aspects of maybe an idea of the supernatural or
Yes, yes,
feminine in sort of a
exactly.
broader or historical
And
context.
it's
or
roaming
something.
around inside there. The cow is roaming around with the dinosaur inside the unconscious, if you will. And or you could say in the landscape of the unconscious, or the landscape of my heart and soul, whatever language you want to use.
Right.
And they're roaming around and they're saying, hey, we're waiting to come up and say hello so we can talk to you. And I have this, I'm going to bring with me this little package of woundedness. Would you please help me? And that's the cycle of reclaiming our
And then
stories.
working with the client, it's possible then to work with to actually tap into maybe not just one or two of those, but sometimes it may be useful to help them kind of inhabit each one of those types of possibilities
Yes,
for a
there's
given
lots
figure.
of ways of doing that without being direct and never being directive. Never being directive. Because then when the therapist's ego takes over and say, this is my sensei. No, it's not. You shut up and you listen deeply and you watch keenly
Carl
and you
Rogers.
attend. Yes, this is Carl Rogers in the deepest Rogerian way. So that's why we use figurines, because we all have the possibility of an altered state of consciousness, which is we dream, we drive and get in a zone here. So when we turn to the figures, they become activated, empowered, with our own landscape in the heart and in the soul of our being.
Before we wrap up, would you mind just saying a couple of words about that phrase or that term, altered consciousness?
Oh,
or
altered state.
What-
So, and anybody can go to the literature. There's lots of really great books that have been around for decades on states of consciousness. And so because this is a projective process, sometimes called a projective technique, unlike the Rorschach, which does need study, this needs a lot more study. And, okay, so bring me back to this.
Yeah, so the question was about altered states.
Yes,
just
altered
like-
state.
yeah.
So we all sleep and dream. Sometimes we remember them. So that dreaming is an altered state. Going into meditation is an altered state. Praying at the synagogue or the chapel or the worshiping grounds. These are all altered states. And indigenous cultures, and we for 40,000 plus years have been able to use our capacity to be in an altered state. And so sometimes that's with smudging and fire and chanting. But when when you watch current videos with dancing and dancers and all of that, or if you watch musicians, they are in an altered state. A musician, an artist, an athlete, they go into an altered state, whether that's swimming or figure skating.
Right, I've heard it called like a zone. I'm
Yes,
in the zone
exactly.
kind of thing.
So the therapist is in the zone
Right.
also.
Okay.
They are in an altered state
Okay.
and not objectifying.
And so the altered state then it's not something we induce in clients to manipulate them in some way. It's just that when we go into this process, it's a natural thing that
It's
takes place.
organic.
That
Yeah.
we just kind of lose ourselves,
Yeah.
or maybe maybe another way of saying it would be to say it's a state of heightened focus.
Exactly.
Or
Yeah,
isolated
we don't lose
focus.
ourselves, we lose ego.
Right. Okay.
That screaming ego that wants to be present and define everything, and this is what I really meant. So goes for lunch, takes a hike, and then the whole rest of the parts of one's humanity can come forward, and unless the therapist stops it, unless if the therapist has never been into deep grief and done the process, it will be too frightening for their own unconscious to go there. So training is really important to help therapists understand rage and grief and fear at its most naked point, its most raw point, because they'll see it in the layers of war and devastation in Sand Sings. I think we've said a lot today.
I think so.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.